Good afternoon, honourable members, Professor Erasmus, and our interpreters, Patrick and Andre. Patrick and Andre, thank you so much for helping us this morning. And I just want to make sure whether we are functional, whether interpretation is working right now. If you could just give me an indication. Honourable members, I think we'll make a start. Welcome, Professor Erasmus. As we explained this morning, honourable members, we will share our presentation this afternoon and run through very quickly some of the issues that we discussed this morning. Professor Erasmus provided a comprehensive overview of the African Continental Free Trade Area for us this morning, and we will just briefly run through the associated presentation, and then we look forward to engaging with you. Without further ado, Professor Erasmus, I'm going to share my screen and hand over to you to start us off.
Thank you, Trudy. Ladies and gentlemen, there was a problem this morning at an early point when the PowerPoint was not shared with you any longer. It was as a result of streaming that took place on the other side, not on our side. So let's now run through this PowerPoint presentation very quickly and fill in more detail where required. And this afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, please pitch in with those questions and clarifications and contributions so that we can cover this topic fully and to your satisfaction. Next slide, please, Trudy. We have explained what the African Continental Free Trade Area is, that it is a flagship of the African Union, that it wants to establish a continental free trade area. You can go to the next one. And we have given you the outline, the elements in this construct, namely that all 55 member states of the AU are participating, but that such a high, ambitious continental-wide regime is not an easy undertaking because countries are at different levels of economic development. We have said several times that the negotiations are not yet complete, and the reasons why the rules of origin and tariff reductions and basic conditions for trade and services are still not complete is because they are complex and far-reaching matters. So states are careful, and states have offensive and defensive interest in these matters. I told you the story about what happened in 2018 when Nigeria didn't pitch up at the adoption and signing ceremony, and that was to some extent not surprising, but it also emphasized how important it is to take the domestic audience and national stakeholders with you. We have mentioned that negotiations started in 2015 at quite a brisk pace, and on the 30th of May 2019, this agreement has already entered into force. Although it cannot be implemented, it is still not complete. So those negotiations on tariffs and rules of origin and certain matters concerning services, they are continuing, and the promise is that it will be done by the end of June this year. Let's see whether that will be whether that will be possible. I also made the point that trade under a free trade area cannot start unless the two essential building blocks are in place. We must know what the lower tariffs are, the preferential rates on the goods, and we must know what the rules of origin are. A little bit later, Trudy will tell us more about rules of origin, but those are the two essential matters. Now, right at the bottom of this slide, there's a very important bit of information to consider, and that is to take into account that 70% of all intra-African trade in goods happens in the SADC region. Now that gives us an indication of what can be done in the rest of the continent, but it also gives an indication of the dominance of the South African economy as far as trade in goods is concerned. So 50% of all intra-African trade in goods happens in SACU, 70% thereof in SADC. Now, I want us to recall this tomorrow again when we will discuss additional implications, and that is, we will start with that discussion this afternoon. What can be done in SADC in order to promote the objectives of the AfCFTA? But for the AfCFTA really to be launched, we need more than lower rates of duty. We need goods. We need to produce goods in our national economies, local industries, competitively, so that there will be customers in other African markets and elsewhere. We're not only going to produce for the local markets, but we need to industrialize, we need to produce the goods and the services for which customers in other African nations will be prepared to pay for, to purchase, to give us that opportunity for market expansion, for commercial presence, and well, in the process, apparently displace other goods from outside Africa that are being consumed at the moment. So international trade agreements don't create trade, they create the conditions under which trade may flourish. Next one, and you must say, Trudy, if you want to add something here, the point about e-commerce that will be in the third phase of the AfCFTA we have also mentioned. Next one.
Thanks, Professor Erasmus. Just before we move on, can we just make sure that those who are using the interpretation facility are able to hear that? If not, please just let me know in the chat room. Thanks very much.
Here we have the general objectives of the AfCFTA. Just let's run through them quickly. That was taken from Article 3 of the agreement. It talks about a single liberalized market for goods and service through further negotiations. In other words, there's a long-term vision here, and it wants in the future to contribute to the movement of capital and natural persons. The movement of natural persons is not at the moment in the agreement. It wants to facilitate investment. That belongs to phase 2. And it wants to build on the developments in the state parties and the RECs. The principle of the acquis, to preserve what has already been agreed. We will meet again later, but here we find it. We find this very, very important element in the structure of the AfCFTA. It does not do away with the RECs. It's a bottom-up approach. It builds further on the developments in the RECs and in the state parties. And at a later stage, hopefully there will be movement towards a continental free trade area and customs union. Now, that will be a very, very bold step, because in a customs union, the parties in a customs union, the state parties, relinquish all policy space over the tariff, over the import tariff, over trade negotiations, because in a customs union, we have a common external tariff and one single customs territory. SADC is not a customs union. and the AfCFTA is not a customs union. They are both FTAs, free trade areas, and it means that the member states retain policy space and control over tariff offers to outside parties, and those outside parties include those beyond the African shores. So the members of an FTA have a very specific advantage. They can individually control and use the import tariff and use trade negotiations to more directly promote their national commercial and development policies. That is not possible in customs union. The AfCFTA says it also wants to resolve the challenge of overlapping memberships. We have mentioned this morning, and there was a little bit of discussion. There is no plan, no action plan in the AfCFTA about how this will happen. It's an objective. Next one, please. The specific objectives. The previous slide dealt with the general long-term objectives. Now we have the specific objectives that can be implemented now and must be. So let's read through what Article 4 says. The state parties of the AfCFTA shall progressively eliminate tariffs and non-tariff barriers for trade in goods, progressively liberalize trade in services, and then cooperate on investment, cooperate on intellectual property rights and competition, and on other trade-related matters such as customs administration. They hereby establish a mechanism for the settlement of disputes. Protocol 3 deals with dispute settlement, but only between the state parties, and that system is based on the WTO dispute settlement understanding. And there is an institutional framework for the AfCFTA, which we discussed in considerable detail this morning. Next one. The governing principles are important. These are the principles. They contain and explain the philosophy that was adopted when the AfCFTA was negotiated. Let's run through them quickly. The AfCFTA is a member-driven arrangement. What does that mean? It means that the member states who take decisions on the basis of consensus, they are in charge of the negotiations, they are in charge of the implementation, and they are in charge of what will subsequently happen to move to a higher level of integration. The RECs, like SADC, the free trade areas of the RECs, are the building blocks of the AfCFTA. This is where everything starts, and these REC free trade areas are remaining in place. Variable geometry is a principle. It means it will be possible for member states to move forward at different speeds. And the idea here is that those that will take it longer will have a little bit of extra time. We find a manifestation of this idea in the modalities that were adopted for trade in goods negotiations for tariff reductions. LDCs are given a longer period for implementing their tariff reductions. Flexibility and special differential treatment are mentioned, but later on we find that this is qualified by reciprocity. Preservation of the acquis, this term means it was borrowed and made part of our Africa integration vocabulary since around 2011 when the tripartite negotiations were conducted, and it means what already has been achieved, what already has been agreed, legally agreed, must be preserved. So that is further confirmation why the liberalization, the reduction of tariffs that has taken place in the RECs will be maintained. MFN and national treatment is about non-discrimination. Reciprocity is very, very central. Here it means that preferences or future benefits will be granted only on the basis of reciprocity. In other words, give and take. Substantial liberalization is necessary in a FTA and in a customs union because that is a legal requirement under the GATT of the WTO. Consensus decision making, I've already mentioned, and there's a brief references here, not to forget the best practices that we already have developed in the past in the RECs and the state parties and AU. Next one. Important features. Trudy, can you quickly take us through this one?
Thanks very much, Professor Erasmus. This, colleagues, is an overview of what the Compact of the African Continental Free Trade Area includes. And it includes a range of legal instruments covering trade in goods, trade in services, investment, intellectual property rights, competition policy, dispute settlement. And now we know too that there is a phase 3 during which we will be negotiating a protocol on e-commerce. That's particularly important. We are also hearing that there is likely to be a protocol on women in trade, and it is likely that additional legal instruments will be added to this ecosystem, this compact that is the African Continental Free Trade Area. When we take a look at trade in goods in particular, as Professor Erasmus has indicated, this is so important to keep in mind that this is a free trade area. So the basic principles and our expectations of what a free trade area will look like is of course very similar to what we have in SADC. In the SADC free trade area, the parties that negotiate liberalization reduce tariffs, they agree on the rules of origin. And as we'll see a little bit later, the rules of origin in a free trade area are particularly important to prevent transshipment. So to prevent goods from coming outside of that group of countries that has negotiated tariff concessions, for goods from outside that group to come in and get the benefit of the lower tariffs. That is particularly important. So the two foundational requirements for a free trade area are the tariff concessions. They must be reciprocal, and we must liberalize substantially all trade. The preferential rules of origin, they will specify how much transformation of inputs, of raw materials has to take place within one of the member states of the AfCFTA for that particular good to be traded under the lower tariffs that will be negotiated by that group of countries. So that's extremely important. These two work in tandem. The rules of origin are the gateway to the lower import duties. If we take a look at relationships with third parties, and again, this is such an important feature of a free trade area, the same applies in SADC. A member like Malawi, which is a member of the SADC Free Trade Area, has undertaken obligations under the SADC Trade Protocol, is able to negotiate trade agreements with third parties. And indeed, Malawi belongs also to COMESA and the COMESA Free Trade Area. The same principle applies to the AfCFTA. The state parties which have undertaken those obligations that they've negotiated and are still negotiating will be able to negotiate trade agreements with third parties. So this is extremely important to keep in mind. Professor Erasmus, the last point, would you like to emphasize the legal implications of that?
Yeah, just to say that we have a provision in the Goods and Trade Protocol, the Protocol on Trade in Goods, Article 4.2, which explicitly states that nothing in this protocol shall prevent a state party to the AfCFTA, from concluding or maintaining preferential trade arrangements with third parties A third party includes countries outside Africa, provided such new trade arrangements or third-party arrangements do not impede or frustrate the objectives of this protocol, and that any advantage, concession, or privilege granted to a third party under new arrangement is extended to other third parties, but on a reciprocal basis. It is not a grant. So if Kenya, which has announced a year ago that it wants to negotiate a comprehensive trade agreement with the United States this year, apparently they have started, what Kenya is proposing to do vis-a-vis the US is completely compatible with the AfCFTA. Kenya must afterwards offer the same preferences to other state parties of the AfCFTA, but then not on a grant basis. It's almost like when a country joins the WTO, you must pay for your accession. There will have to be negotiations on the give and take. So for what Kenya plans to do is okay with the AfCFTA. It might not be so easy and fully compatible when it comes to Kenya's membership of the East African community. Why not? Well, because the East African community has proceeded to deeper levels and further levels of integration and has adopted statements and documents saying that the EAC is a customs union. Now, in a customs union, as we've said before, the member states have lost their individual freedom to negotiate with third parties. So I think that part of the Kenya counter argument will be that the customs union part of the EAC is not yet fully operational. It is still a work in progress, and that whatever it agrees by way of new preferences with the US, it will presumably extend to the others. But that's a little bit more complicated because you cannot, as Kenya, unilaterally extend membership of such a bilateral agreement with the US to Tanzania and Burundi and Rwanda and Uganda and South Sudan. So we haven't seen any texts yet, but one can guess that what Kenya will do is to be quite open and upfront with the US authorities. Everyone knows about this concern of the other EAC members, and to get the possibility built into that agreement that other member states of the EAC could also join the arrangement. That will make good sense. As a matter of fact, we see other examples of this elsewhere in the continent. In 2016, the EU concluded with the 5 member states of SACU plus Mozambique. They concluded the SACU-EU Economic Partnership Agreement. And there's a provision in there that Angola may join it if it subsequently wants to do so. But then, of course, it must go through the necessary negotiations. Final observation, a court application has been filed in Arusha with the EAC Court of Justice by a group of private lawyers in the EAC. The EAC law fraternity has brought that application, not any of the other EAC member states, for a court order that will instruct Kenya to discontinue its negotiations with the US. So we can monitor that. It's quite far-reaching, but let's wait and see. Next one, please, Trudy. The RECs will not disappear. Here we are citing Article 19.2.2 from the agreement, and it says that state parties that are members of other regional communities, regional trading arrangement and customs unions, which have attained among themselves higher levels of integration than under the AfCFTA agreement, shall maintain such higher levels, shall maintain it. Now, that is a very, very important notion. I repeatedly referred this morning to the fact that The regs are not abolished. They will continue. As a matter of fact, they are the building blocks of the AfCFTA. So here we have, if we needed explicit confirmation of that, here it is. There is another provision in Article 8, paragraph 2 of the Protocol on Trade in Goods saying the same. So let's look at what the implications further are and what we can say about trade in services. We will come back to the question of how the regs can contribute to the AfCFTA consolidation. We'll come back to that. But we must also pause a moment and look at another important feature of the AfCFTA. It is not only a trade in goods arrangement. As a matter of fact, it moves towards the category of a new generation FTA, as we are observing happening in the rest of the world, by deliberately excluding trade in goods, trade in services, and in the second phase, investment, competition, intellectual property rights, and as Trudy said a few minutes ago, also e-commerce. Trudy, can you tell us how far have the negotiations in the AfCFTA proceeded in terms of liberalizing trade in services, and how will they do it? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Professor Erasmus. Colleagues, just to recall that the importance of services in all our economies is absolutely critical to its inclusion in the AfCFTA agreement. In most of our countries, services contribute more than 50% of economic activity. When we take a look at employment creation, for example, services sectors play a very important role, and increasingly we are trading services across borders. Many services are now technology or digitally enabled. So healthcare, communication, education services are all now digitally enabled, so they become tradable. And so very important that we have a comprehensive agenda in the AfCFTA for the negotiation of liberalization of trade and services. Now, what we have concluded already is the Protocol on Trade and Services. This is really the umbrella agreement. It sets out the basic principles. We also know that there are 5 priority services sectors that have been identified: financial services, transport, communication, professional services, and tourism. We spoke this morning briefly about tourism and the movement of persons across borders to consume tourism services, increasingly very important, intra-Africa, as well as, of course, the tourism that links us to the global economy. But how does trade and services take place? Now, this is so important because it is once we take a look at the different modes of supply that we know how liberalization will be negotiated. And as we've mentioned, it's possible to supply services cross-border without the movement of the services provider or the services user or consumer. We are doing that this afternoon. I'm in Cape Town, Professor Erasmus is in Stellenbosch, and in fact, honorable members, you are spread across the member states of SADC. So digitally enabled services such as this are extremely important. So that's the first mode of supply. The second one requires movement of the services user or consumer across a border. So a tourist, a consultant, a teacher, a lecturer who travels across a border to deliver educational services. That's cross-border supply. The third mode of supply in terms of overall value is the most important one, and that is establishment of commercial presence. So this is where we have cross-border investment, foreign direct investment, taking place, for example, in the financial services sector, where Absa Bank or Barclays Bank opens a branch in another country to supply financial services to consumers, to enterprises in that foreign country. And this means that we have an important link between the trade and services agenda and the investment agenda. So we start to see how interconnected the different streams of governance and the different streams of negotiations are in the context of the AfCFTA and indeed any other modern FTA negotiations process. And then the fourth mode of supply, this requires the temporary movement of the services supplier. So this is where a lecturer would travel across to go and supply services in a foreign jurisdiction, or an architect or an engineer. It's not to be confused with immigration. It's temporary movement of services suppliers. That's so important to keep in mind. So when we take a look at the substance of our negotiations, we're going to be liberalizing trade and services in these different modes of supply. And what we're currently busy with is for the 5 priority services sectors to take a look at sector commitments. And these relate to market access, so opening our market to foreign services that can come in via digital supply or as a result of movement, temporary movement of the services supplier into our jurisdiction. So that will be the market access component. And then secondly, national treatment. What will be the treatment of that foreign service or foreign services supplier? And usually what we do when we take a look at the negotiations is to note the limitations both on market access and national treatment. In other words, we may require that if a foreign bank establishes a commercial presence in our territory, that they do that via a joint venture, so that there be local ownership, equity participation in that investment. So these are the kind of details that we are busy negotiating at the moment. It means we do that sector by sector, and keep in mind within each sector that we're looking at, there are numbers of subsectors. So in the case of financial services, we will have, for example, banking service, we will have insurance services, and a whole range of related services, including also services such as asset management. So there is a lot of detail to be negotiated. And again, it's no surprise that it takes a long time to negotiate these details. But this process is underway. And the aim is also that we complete the negotiations of these sector commitments by the end of June. And here we are back to an overview of the architecture of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, the AfCFTA Agreement. And here we have at the top, honorable members, you're very familiar with this already from our previous encounters, the agreement establishing the AfCFTA. So this is the framework agreement. And then we see the specific legal instruments. So we have in phase 1, the negotiations which have already delivered a protocol on trade and goods, a protocol on trade and services, and a protocol on dispute settlement. For each of these,
we have dealt with this one in considerable detail this morning because our presentation got stuck on this one. We couldn't move.
Excellent. Then let's move on from that. Institutions, Professor Rasmus, over to you.
Yeah, very quickly, we have discussed, without the benefit of this slide, the institutions. Now, just to recap, at the top, we have the Assembly of the AU, which is the highest decision-making organ of the AU, not of the AfCFTA. If you look at the relevant provisions, you will see that in Article 10 of the agreement, it tells us what the structures are, what the institutions are, and it says that the Assembly shall have the exclusive power to adopt interpretations and make recommendations to the Council of Ministers. It is actually the link organization that links the AfCFTA to the African Union. There are, of course, 55 member states in the African Union and in its assembly. We don't know how many there will be in the AfCFTA. So the most important body is the Council of Ministers. I explained to you that that is where the ministers will meet at least twice a year. They take decisions on the basis of consensus. They can issue regulations. They give instructions to the next body, the Committee of Senior Trade Officials, and the Committee of Senior Trade Officials shall liaise with the Secretariat and the member states and assist the Council of Ministers. So here we have the most important one in my view, a technical body, and the next slide tells us about the Secretariat. The Secretariat is functionally autonomous, it is permanent, it is a technical body, and it is headquartered in Accra. It has started and it is now helping with concluding the outstanding negotiations. It has many monitoring and support functions in respect of trade remedies, NTBs, dispute settlement, and so on. There's a African Trade Observatory that will be established. Trudy can tell us about that. But finally, I just want to mention that in different parts of the agreement, we find the references to ad hoc bodies. The trade protocol provides for an ad hoc body on called the Committee on Trade in Goods. So there will be a Committee on Trade in Services. And then there will be beneath them other ad hoc bodies where officials will meet from time to time to discuss standards, trade remedies, NTBs, trade facilitation, customs cooperation. For each and every one of the annexes, there is such a platform. These are not permanent institutions. They are platforms where representatives of the member states, of the state parties of the AfCFTA will meet from time to time. What will the African Trade Observatory do, Trudy?
The African Trade Observatory is an extremely important initiative, honourable members. As you will well know, that access to accurate, reliable trade data is still a major challenge for many countries on the continent. And so as economists, we often rely on what we call mirror data. So if we don't have data on the exports from a particular country, we take a look at the countries that are importing from that exporter. So we look at the mirror data, but accurate data, reliable data is particularly important, not only for trade negotiations, but for effective trade policy making. It is also really important for the private sector to know who are they competing with in different export markets. So where do the goods come from that they will be competing with in the countries that they are negotiating with under the AfCFTA? So the African Trade Observatory is an initiative. It's an initiative of the African Union Commission, the AfCFTA Secretariat, and it is supported by the International Trade Center, which is a joint initiative of the United Nations linked closely to UNCTAD and the World Trade Organization. And it will be a portal where up-to-date and reliable data will be made available, but not only trade data, honorable members, but also information on applicable regulations and other requirements. The rules of origin will be available there. So it becomes a one-stop shop to go to find trade-related information. And not only for trade in goods, but also very importantly for trade in services. There will be information about intellectual property rights, the domestic legislation, for example, competition laws, regulations, merger notification requirements, because keep in mind, for example, if a financial services provider invests in another AfCFTA state party, that transaction will be notified to the competition authority. And so the applicable competition laws and regulations will be particularly relevant to study and to comply with. So this is currently in process. There is a site that we can have a look at if we have time a little bit later, but it is still work in progress. There is a lot of work in terms of updating all the databases. And the big challenge, honorable members, will be to keep it up to date. Because as you know, data that is out of date is not particularly useful to policymakers, to analysts, or to traders. Thanks, Professor Erasmus.
Trudy, can you clarify something for me? You make it sound as if this African Trade Observatory will bring about a miracle. We all know that the collection of data and the classification and publication of data is a major problem in Africa. Now, how will this miracle suddenly be performed by a new continental body? Where will it obtain the data? How many goods have moved across the border of this particular country? What will it do to make things different? Why will it be this miracle?
I don't think we should expect miracles. It takes a lot of hard work. And honorable members, if we think about how we collect trade data, if we think about trade in goods, data is collected by the customs officers at the border. So as consignments of goods cross through border posts, there we have all the documentation which is required in terms of the classification of the products, their HS harmonized system codes, the value of the consignment, the product description. All of that information is captured by our customs authorities. What happens to it then? Then it goes to the National Statistics Office, where the data is reconciled with financial flow data. Because of course, for every flow of goods across the border, there is a corresponding flow of revenue. So we can double check whether in fact the data is correct. But then there's also the reconciliation we can do between the exporting country and the importing country. Because just as customs officers monitor goods leaving a country, at the port of entry, they are also monitoring the goods coming into the country. So there is data reconciliation, which is extremely important. The National Statistics Officers work to reconcile, to clean the data, to verify it, and to put it together in the National Statistics Database. Then all UN member states are required to submit their data, not only on trade, but on all economic activities, financial matters, and so on. They submit that data to the United Nations Statistics Office. And here, that data is consolidated for all members of the United Nations. Now it's from there that, for example, UNCTAD, the World Trade Organization, and other institutions would be able to get the data. And this will apply to the African Trade Observatory as well. Now, there are also a lot of projects underway to verify data with the national sources. So to go to the National Statistics Offices to make sure that the data is correct, that the data is kept up to date. Because as I've mentioned, there may be instances where a country is not collecting its data as accurately as may be necessary. But through the reconciliation process, we can check imports against exports. And so make sure it all adds up to give us a complete picture. So there will be initiatives to work with the National Statistics Officers, with the customs authorities, to improve the quality of data. It is a daunting undertaking to make sure we have data for all the member states of the AfCFTA, and in fact of the African Union, that is up to date, that is released expeditiously so that it is available on the African Trade Observatory. The state at the moment, honorable members, is that there are some countries on the African continent that have for some years not reported their data to the United Nations. or have not released their full statistical databases on trade. But this needs to improve. If we are going to improve the quality of trade governance, the quality of trade performance, and the quality of trade policy making, then access to accurate data is absolutely critical. So this is something that we should be asking our member states about. Have we reported our data to the UN Statistics Office? Will our data be kept up to date on the African Trade Observatory? Now that's trade and goods data. When it comes to trade and services, of course, a lot of trade and services takes place, in a sense, in an invisible format. So the customs officers at the border will not see services fly across the border. So, for example, if we have an architect designing a building and sending those plans via the internet, there will be a corresponding financial flow. So our central banks are very important means of keeping track of trade and services. So it's those payments for services that we monitor very, very carefully. And this means that if we look at the global architecture for keeping track of trade and services, the International Monetary Fund, honorable members, becomes really important, because this is really a focal point for our balance of payments, our current account tracking systems. So there are, again, global institutions involved in collecting and monitoring that data and verifying that data. And increasingly, we find across financial services institutions globally that there are information sharing agreements, so that it's becoming increasingly difficult, not impossible, but increasingly difficult to, in a sense, trade under the radar. Illicit trade is still obviously a major issue when it comes to trade in goods and trade in services. And there are a number of projects across our region, but also obviously globally, that are trying to get to grips with the size, the nature, the content of illicit trade and the associated illicit financial flows. So there are a lot of really, really important governance issues when we talk about trade data that are behind the figures that you and I see when we open the Trade Observatory and have a look at the trade data.
Thank you so much, Trudy. Can you go to the next one, please? That is a depiction, ladies and gentlemen, of where we stand in March this year with the ratification of the AfCFTA agreement. At that point, 36 from 54 AU member states have ratified this agreement. The agreement already entered into force a year earlier at the end of 2019, not the end in May, the end of May 2019, this agreement entered into force. Here you've got information about it, but still no trade under this agreement. Next one. How do the RECs fit into the AfCFTA scheme of things? Well, the RECs are not parties to the AfCFTA agreement. The parties are states. They are called the state parties once they have ratified or acceded to. So there are important implications. The RECs continue with the implementation of their own agendas, as we said before. So we have to distinguish between existing intra-REC preferences, and they are going back some time, because they are the existing preferences and they only apply to the members of the particular REC. So only the member states of SADC benefit from the preferential trade amongst the SADC member states. And the next category is there will be new AfCFTA preferences. They will only apply to trade that for the first time will be conducted under preferential rules between African states. Remember my example of the of the apples being exported to countries in ECOWAS from South Africa. There is a lot of trade already, and for years between the SADC member states, of which South Africa is part, and the ECOWAS states. But that was always conducted under the MFN rates of the WTO. Once the AfCFTA is in force, and if all the SADC states and the ECOWAS states are parties to the AfCFTA, then in future the apples will be exported from the Cape area to the countries in ECOWAS under the preferential rights and rules of origin of the AfCFTA, and that is where the benefit will kick in. That is the value that will be added to intra-African trade in terms of further liberalization and more preferential rates being applicable. The RECs are mostly legal persons in their own right. If you look at your own SADC treaty, as we will do tomorrow, you will see it says there, SADC is a legal person. SADC as legal personality. But SADC in itself is not a party to the AfCFTA. But legal personality confirms another aspect of the basis of existence of SADC, and that it will continue to do so. Now, how will the RECs contribute to the AfC objectives? Well, there are different potential answers to this one. Just by staying in existence and further advancing continental integration and deepening that process, it will make an indirect contribution to trade liberalization in Africa. If SADC deepens its integration, and already 70% of the trade in goods on the continent takes place in SADC, we will see that that will bring benefits. Now, could the RECs align their own regional agendas to that of the AfCFTA? Well, that will not be so straightforward, because it's one thing to say that the RECs are building blocks, but what is a building block? The AfCFTA does not tell us in any detail what these building blocks will do in order to contribute to the AfCFTA. And that's why I read to you that quote in the beginning from Article 3, which says that in the long run, a more liberalized market for goods and services will be created on the continent through successive rounds of negotiations. And I think that is the most concrete answer to be given on how the RECs will continue to, or how the RECs will contribute rather to the AfCFTA. It is actually the member states of the RECs that will have to make these decisions through their membership of the Council of Ministers, and to decide on further initiatives, on further negotiations in the future. It will take some time and effort. I did mention that we still have to find problems to overlapping membership. And here there's an interesting candidate not to forget. Tomorrow we will look at, in a little bit more detail, at the tripartite free trade area, which was an initiative between SADC, COMESA, and the EAC about 10 years ago. And that resulted in many negotiations to consolidate the three RECs of SADC, the EAC, and COMESA, but that plan was then watered down and the acquis got involved. But if that type of initiative could follow in the future, we may see another avenue, another path towards continental integration. But that does not look very likely at the moment. The recipe for the moment is we stick to the RECs that we have, and there are no plans to get rid of them and to make them disappear or dissolve into a continental arrangement. Can disputes regarding the AfCFTA land before regional courts? Well, we know that the AfCFTA has a dispute settlement protocol, but that protocol is only there for disputes between states, between state parties. Now we know that our African governments don't declare don't declare disputes against each other. So what I'm asking here is a different question. If RECs start to implement obligations that have originated in the AfCFTA documents, but have filtered down to REC level. Let's say there is a new dispensation in COMESA on dealing with NTBs, non-tariff barriers, as a result of initiatives that will be undertaken by the AfCFTA Secretariat. If those initiatives, which the Secretariat will undertake and for which there are institutions, if those initiatives result in a closer and a more refined and a more advanced regime in the different RECs, in the 8 RECs, on dealing with and eliminating NTBs, then of course it will have a multiplying effect. Because if we remove NTBs at a border post between countries A and B, there's no logical reason why that should not be extended to C and D and E and F. And then the overlapping membership will kick in and the benefits will expand. And these newer approaches may then become even part of the law, of the legal system of particular RECs. That is the dynamic side of what can happen here. But that will be incremental and it will take time. So it may just be that the REC courts, the courts of the regional economic communities, may in this indirect manner become involved in issues about the legal status of obligations and compliance. But of course, the happy news is that we in SADC do not have a tribunal any longer. Our tribunal was abolished in 2011 when it had made a ruling against one of the member states, against Zimbabwe. And from that day on, after the leadership abolished that court, there has not been such a court. So we are at a disadvantage because regional courts allow firms and persons also to file applications. So if you are lucky enough to be in ECOWAS or in the EAC or in COMESA, you can take your problems to the regional courts. If you are in SADC, you can't do so. The final point to make here is just a reminder, Article 12, paragraph 6 says, the REC shall be represented in the Committee of Senior Trade Officials in an advisory capacity. What exactly that means, we don't yet know. And we don't know what they will do there. But this is an example of a basic provision in the AfCFTA indicating that the RECs, as in their capacity as the regional economic communities, must figure somewhere, We haven't yet got a dedicated platform for that to happen for the RECs. It's all suggested indirectly. Realities will have to kick in, and at some point, presumably, we will see more active participation by the RECs. We noted this morning that the RECs we have picked up are participating in the deliberations organized by the Secretariat, AfCFTA Secretariat, to complete the negotiations and to put all the additional paperwork in place. So maybe there are already technical staff from the SADC Secretariat that on a regular basis participate in these meetings. But of course, these meetings are virtual at this point. Next one, Trudy. Okay, that's for your account, Trudy, the rules of origin.
Thank you very much, Professor Asmus. Honourable colleagues, this is just a summary of some intra-Africa trade data. taking a look at exports and imports. And what we do see is that if we take a look at the most important importers on the continent from other African countries, South Africa and Botswana, 2 members of SADC, and also it happens to be 2 members of SADC who feature very prominently. I will leave this for you to have a look at, and if you have questions, you'll be able to ask us. This again, just taking a look at intra-regional economic community trade. And what we do see here is how important intra-reg trade is in SADC in terms of contributing to overall intra-Africa trade. The overlapping membership of REGs is also really important. So in the case of SADC, of course, we've got COMESA and SADC overlapping. Tanzania belongs to the East African community, and then self-contained, so to speak, within SADC is, of course, all the member states of the Southern African Customs Union. So this, at your leisure, you'll be able to have a look at this data and you can ask us some questions. Very important on tariffs and rules of origin is just to take a look at where we stand in terms of the AfCFTA negotiations, what our level of ambition is. And this is just to confirm, keep in mind the block at the bottom here indicates that we are aiming to complete the negotiations on tariffs and rules of origin by the end of June. This is in terms of the decision made by our heads of state in December last year. And very important, as we know, our countries are busy making their tariff offers, preparing their concessions, which will then be traded, so to speak, and negotiations will begin. Just a reminder, as we know already, that we're aiming to liberalize 90% of tariff lines. The additional 10% will be divided between 7%, which are designated sensitive, and any one of these criteria listed on the right-hand side may be the cause for a product being designated sensitive. Could be food security, national security, fiscal revenue, livelihood, or indeed industrialization. Now we know that SADC has a protocol on industry and a very important initiative to promote regional industrial development has been undertaken since about 2014. 3% of tariff lines may be excluded entirely. These are very, very sensitive. They may be products produced in sectors and industries where employment creation is at a premium, and therefore we will not liberalize those tariff lines. Rules of origin, there's still a lot of work in progress, honorable members. There are a number of chapters. So this is a collection of tariff lines where we have not made any progress to date. The chapter on fish, keep in mind different varieties of fish, different fish products. It may be filleted fish, it may be frozen fish. They each have their own product description and tariff line. We're still negotiating those rules of origin. Articles of leather, crocheted, knitted fabrics, and clothing made from those fabrics are still to be negotiated. Vehicles, motor vehicles, agricultural, and other clothing products are also very sensitive. And what we see when we take a look at the rules of origin and the tariff negotiations is that those products that are sensitive, those are the ones where it's also very difficult to agree on the rules of origin, because the rules of origin, as we mentioned, perform a gatekeeper function. So if the rules of origin are strict, they may well be able to keep import competition to a minimum. What are the rules of origin? They are rules which will determine the national origin of the product. So when it comes to agricultural products, animal products, for example, the rule of origin is often wholly obtained. This means that the animal must be born, bred, and raised within a particular country. Then that product will be of national origin, say Zimbabwe or Malawi, as the case may be. For industrial products, we look at transformation, so value addition. So in the clothing and textile industry, we look at the transformation from yarn to fabric to garment. And in the case of rules of origin in SADC, we know that for clothing and textiles, we have a double transformation rule of origin. So a yarn forward rule, both the fabric and the garment must be produced in a SADC country to get the benefit of the lower tariffs that SADC member states in the FDA have negotiated. Where do we stand in the AfCFTA? About 81% of the rules of origin have been agreed. But as we know, it's often that last mile that is the most difficult to conclude. Just reiterating the difficult areas in the negotiations where the sensitive products are fish. Sugar is another very important sensitive agricultural product. Leather, garments, and motor vehicles have in recent years become quite sensitive because many of our countries have received foreign investment and we are engaged in component manufacture or even motor vehicle assembly. So we've become quite sensitive about protecting our domestic interests. This, honorable members, is just some detail. And here we have, this is the HS chapter, the harmonized system. That's the International System of Product Classification, the chapter name, and the specific product descriptions. These products are the ones where the negotiations are still underway. So if we look, for example, at woven fabrics, gauze, narrow woven fabrics, embroidery, those products are still not concluded as far as the rules are concerned. Buttermilk and cheese, wheat and muslin flour. Prepared and probable members, and we are aware that we're going over the allotted time this afternoon, but this is just simply a reminder again that the regs continue to exist. So SADC and its free trade area, free trade agreement, will continue to function under the SADC legal instruments that have been concluded by SADC member states. Keep in mind that for SADC, the trade and services agenda is still work in progress. We'll talk a little bit about that tomorrow, but the SADC free trade area for goods, that was concluded many years ago and it was launched in August 2008, and liberalization continued obviously beyond that. The aim was that for most countries, tariff liberalization would be concluded by 2012, for Mozambique 2015, but there is still some work in progress. But a lot of work has been done already to consolidate the free trade area in SADC. In the same way, if we take a look, for example, at ECOWAS or COMESA, the East African Community, they have their own trade regimes. There are some regional economic communities like IGAD and CENSAD. They don't have any trade arrangements yet. So they are regional economic communities. They have a broad integration agenda, but no trade liberalization or trade integration agenda just yet. So what we see is that the regional economic communities are at different levels of development, particularly when it comes to trade integration and liberalization. Trade governance in SADC, I'm going to skip this because this is exactly what we're going to be talking about tomorrow. The protocol on trade, focusing on trade in goods, trade in services, protocol on trade and services, work in progress there, the finance and investment protocol. This will be what we focus on tomorrow, honorable members. We've spoken this morning about the launch of trade. Professor Rasmus, anything to add here?
No, I think I did quite a detailed job this morning. It's for you to add now.
Excellent. Honorable members, the decision, as Professor Rasmus mentioned this morning, to launch trade on the 1st of January 2021 was a really important one. And what we then had to ask was, but what would be the applicable tariffs at the border posts if, just as we've been discussing this afternoon and this morning, negotiations to reduce tariffs are still underway and the rules of origin have not been concluded. So a bespoke interim arrangement had to be crafted. And what the heads of state did was to say, but in the absence of the finalization of negotiations on tariffs and rules of origin, what could we do? And they agreed that the tariff offers made by the state parties who are negotiating these concessions with one another, they could be the applicable tariffs in this interim arrangement. Now, honorable members, we've got to keep in mind that the process of tariff negotiations continues. So the opening bid, say a country like Malawi makes, would be the tariff offer. But once other countries also make tariff offers, then of course the negotiation process continues with requests and offers taking place bilaterally until we reach some point where the necessary compromises are acceptable to all parties, and then we have a negotiated outcome. But in the absence of that, what we have now is that the tariff offers, the opening bid, so to speak, that have been made by member states of the African Union, the state parties that are negotiating these concessions, will be the applicable tariffs. Very important that these tariff offers be reciprocal. So for example, if Malawi would like to trade with Morocco, then both Malawi and Morocco must have made a tariff offer that is compliant with the modalities of the negotiations. The modalities as agreed, 90% of tariff lines must be liberalized, must be offered, 7% can be designated sensitive, and 3% can be excluded. The rules of origin are critical here because trade, as of the 1st of January, in terms of this interim dispensation, only possible for those products that have agreed rules of origin. Otherwise, honorable members, we would not be able to prevent transshipment. So products that should not be getting access to those lower tariffs would then be traded under the AfCFTA. And then, of course, customs readiness, as we spoke about this morning. So the tariff book must be adapted, changed. Customs procedures must be adopted. The customs and excise legislation must be amended. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done to ensure that countries are customs ready so that when goods arrive at the border post, all the necessary documentation is in place. A rules of origin certificate, a standard certificate. If, for example, a health certificate for a food product is required, that should be available. And meanwhile, the negotiations continue. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. So what we have also underway are negotiations on phase 2, the protocol on investment, competition policy, and intellectual property rights. The negotiations on investment began about 3 weeks ago, and we will monitor that closely. Competition policy negotiations and intellectual property rights negotiations will also be starting in earnest very soon. And then phase 3 negotiations on e-commerce. Those are to be completed by the end of the year as well, but we haven't seen any news in the public domain just yet about the phase 3 negotiations. And as we mentioned, further into the future, we may also see negotiations, for example, to produce a protocol on women in trade. So there is still a lot of work to be done as far as these negotiations are concerned. Professor Erasmus, comments from you?
I've got no comments on what you've just said. How far do you still want to continue to read?
I think we have spoken about non-tariff barriers this morning, so in quite a lot of detail. The other topic that we did have was to take a look at the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System, but that we can do tomorrow when we take a look at SADC and we discuss those matters related to the Finance and Investment Protocol. So what we could do in the interest of time is to take questions, if there are any right now, on what we have covered, and then we'll pick up the discussion on SADC tomorrow and take a look at the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System, because of course SADC has its own regional payments and settlement system. So it'll be important for us to take a look at the relationship between the two. Professor Erasmus, on your side?
No, I fully agree with that approach. Let's hear whether there are questions or contributions, observations. Well, if there aren't any, then we hope this was a smoother presentation this afternoon, in the sense that we were not again hijacked midway.
Professor, my hand is up, Prof.
Okay, let's go into the chat room there, Trudy. I like that. Please tell me that your hand is okay. Trudy, I can't. Can you help us here and see what Trudy, unmute Trudy.
Honorable Tsepang, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much, Trudy. And it's always very insightful to hear presentations like we are having this afternoon. I just have a few questions on what you have both been informing us on. The first one is on I know that Professor talked about it this morning, and you've just talked about it as well, Trudy, on the issue of regional trading arrangements that are of higher levels, that are on higher levels, that are of higher levels, which will remain the same, that like they will not change once we get into the AfCFTA arrangement. I just want to understand, for my clarity, do we mean that when we say higher levels, is it referring to more benefit versus the prevailing situation? Just make me understand that aspect, because that's what I have in my head when we're saying we will maintain the arrangements of higher level. If that is the case, that's number one. But then still on the same, are we referring to the arrangement being of higher level on a like now when we are getting into the AfCFTA arrangement, or there will have to be we'll have to keep on checking throughout the life of the AfCFTA if the arrangements are now changing, such that the benefit or the status quo would have to remain the same if the situation remains the same, or it will have to change if the benefit now seems to be changing. That's the first question, or rather the second one. Now, the third one, you referred, when you talked to African Union institutions, you referred to quite a number of things, but one that stood out for me is when you were referring to the consultations, for example, that have to be done with the competition authority when one wishes to exercise the AfCFTA regimen. So my question is, from your point of view, what legislative areas do we need to be concerned with now that we are getting into the AfCFTA, I think the competition aspect that you are referring to tells us that we have to worry about the competition bills in our countries. But I'm even wondering if we're talking internally, or we're talking regionally, or we're talking continentally. That's number one. I think you've also talked about the intellectual property rights, the protocols on investment. I just want to have a guidance on which legislative tools do we have to worry about as members of parliament that our governments or our countries are actually working on, so that we fit nicely into the AfCFTA. And then the other one talks to the intra-Africa trade, the snippet that you gave us of the situation right now, the intra-Africa trade, which countries are performing better, blah, blah, blah. But my question is on how you, now that we're talking rules of origin, etc., new language, I just want to understand how we look at the intra-Africa trade. Do we look at it from the point of view of products? You are even talking about services, Trudy, so maybe you can expand on that as well. But are we talking of items that are bought from one country to another, or to what extent do we refer to when we're talking about the intra-trade that you've talked about? And the last one really is just on the issue of the rules of origin. Earlier in the morning, when Professor was talking, I was actually when he indicated that the agricultural products, it might be very easy to know or to work out the rules of origin. But for other products that, for example, you might just be adding buttons to some textiles, and now you have to worry about whether you can identify the rules of origin as a particular country. Now, you were just mentioning, Trudy, that there are some negotiations that are still ongoing as far as the rules of origin is concerned. I just got worried when you mentioned agriculture as one area, but then you actually elaborated further on it that it's actually the byproducts, if that's the right word, out of the agricultural products that you are still that are still being negotiated as far as the rules of origin are concerned. This one is just a comment, but otherwise those are my questions on the presentation. Thank you so very much.
Okay, Trudy, I think most of those questions are for you. So let me start firing away with the references to high levels of integration. And I'm grateful for these questions. They are excellent questions, and they are exactly the type of issues that need to be considered and need to be clarified. Just a quick clarification before I go into Article 19. You correctly point out that member states and regions have, some of them at least, REC member states, and some of the RECs have competition authorities, competition commissions in those countries, individual countries, and they are here and there, like in COMESA, we find regional competition authorities. So what is going to happen now in the context of additional rules and procedures on competition and intellectual property? Now, just a qualification, those negotiations have just started. In some cases, I don't think even they have started discussing intellectual property rights. So you and I and Trudy can speak, and all the others can speculate together about what will come out of these phase 2 negotiations. In particular, your interest in particular for competition and intellectual property rights, and also for investment. What we do know is that the phase 2 negotiations will be about cooperation. In other words, the investment protocol, the competition protocol will be frameworks for cooperation between the state parties. That is what will count. Only the state parties of the AfCFTA have obligations, rights, benefits, responsibilities. The RECs are not included. The RECs are not parties. So if the future competition and IP and investment protocols are about cooperation, and there haven't been any texts that we can share with you or can study. But the indication is it will not create substantive firm obligations for the state parties to establish a continental competition authority or a continental investment authority of that kind. It will be about cooperation. What will that mean? It will mean that the state parties will retain policy space and power over what investments they will bring in, how they will regulate competition issues, mergers and acquisitions, and then cooperate with another state party that has the same. That is what cooperation in a translated form will mean. If you have to, as state parties cooperate, then you cooperate about what you have in place. And if these negotiations want to up the game and tell us, well, if you haven't got a competition commission, you must get one. Or if you haven't got sufficient rules on intellectual property, you must get one, or you must put it in place. That will be some interesting music. That will be some interesting stuff. And we can see whether that will happen. Now, let's go back to your first question, which I find an astute one, a very relevant and useful question. As I understand the question, you want me to explain, what do I mean with the level of integration? And the only answer that I really can give you is, let's read slowly together, all of us, through Article 19. Now, through the Article 19 of the agreement is on the screen. Would it be possible to take us back there? I would be grateful. Thanks, Trudy. There we go. There we go. Okay, here we have the answer, and as we like to say at Tralak, if we have to find out what the intention is of the parties, we don't go and ask the negotiators. We go and consult the text, the legal instrument which they have adopted. Now, what does it say here? State parties, that is state parties of the AfCFTA, that are members of other regional economic communities, or regional trading arrangements, or customs unions, which have attained among themselves higher levels of regional integration than under this agreement, shall maintain such higher levels among themselves. Now let's break it down. Let's use SADC. SADC has X number of member states. So it counts as one of these other regional economic communities. If the level of regional integration among the SADC member states are higher or deeper, we can also say, if SADC has moved further in terms of removing tariffs, removing NTBs, speeding up procedures at border posts, customs administration, any of the disciplines that you find under those 10 annexes under the trade protocol. If the SADC regime goes further, what this principle says, what this provision says, it confirms the acquis. It says what has already been achieved, we continue to comply with and we continue to promote. In other words, you don't go back. So this is a factual question. If integration in the EAC or in ECOWAS or in SADC-COMESA or whatever has moved to a deeper level or to a higher extent, then of course the benefits for the members of SADC have to be retained. Don't move back. That will be a very stupid thing to do, is to unravel the benefits that we already have. Now, what is covered by regional integration? Regional integration concerns all the disciplines about trade in goods and services. Now, it will cover, right from the beginning, it will cover tariffs, it will cover rules of origin, but it will also cover non-tariff barriers. It will cover customs administration. It will cover trade facilitation, the procedures for SPS and TBT. Now, let's ask ourselves, let's give ourselves a deliberate naughty example. Let's say that the trade among the SADC member states in livestock, in cattle and sheep and goats, is a restricted and limited area because we've got high incidence of animal disease and so on. If we go and we negotiate as SADC member states, when we negotiate there in Accra or in others, let's say we negotiate more lenient, more advanced, better, further going rules on SPS and TBT, then we have under the SADC arrangement. Then obviously, if all of us who are member states of SADC are also state parties to the AfCFTA, then firms that find themselves in our countries will look at the rules that the new rules that we have now accepted and say, no, let's go for the new ones, for the better ones. That is what this literally means. And it's for this reason that we have to study the outcome and find out. But it's also for this reason that you will see that the member states of the RECs, when they negotiate the AfCFTA, they are, in most instances, quite conservative when it comes to these other mechanisms. They will say, when it comes to SPS, they will say we look at the guidelines from the WTO and so on. So the convergence between the RECs and the AfCFTA will require that we look at each and every area. The main action will be with respect to tariffs, non-tariffs, NTBs, and to rules of origin. And Trudy has done some very interesting work. She has, and she can share that with us tomorrow. She has looked at the offers, the tariff offers that have been made as part of the tariff negotiations under the AfCFTA. And she then compared them to column by column with what we have in SADC, in SACO, and even what we have under the EU SADC-EPA. And our levels in the RECs, as far as tariffs are concerned, are considerably lower than what is being offered in the AfCFTA context. Have I answered you in terms of that question on what Article 92 means? But
yes.
It also means that there can be future action to bring these things together.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor. You have really elaborated. Thank you.
Thank you. I will drink a good glass of Shiraz tonight on that achievement. Now it's over to Trudy.
Thank you very much for that, Professor Erasmus. These are indeed very pertinent questions. I want to come back to the issues around what should we be watching, which areas of governance, competition policy, investment, intellectual property rights, and the answer is all of the above. But competition, for example, I think if we take a look at the countries that are members of the SADC integration arrangement, the broader REC members, and then also the members of the SADC free trade area, then we see that quite a number of them, in fact, most of them now actually have a domestic law policy and an institution. And there are a few still that are working on that at the moment. So it means that domestic governance exists in most SADC member states. At regional level, we have an instrument to cooperate on competition policy matters. So we've signed a declaration, for example, and we've signed various cooperation instruments. It may well be that these will be similar to what we see under the AfCFTA. But what will be applicable? And let's take a practical example. Let's say EcoBank, which comes from Togo, is going to invest in Malawi. That investment takes the form of a joint venture or the acquisition of a domestic bank in Malawi. Then that transaction will have to be notified to the Malawi Competition Authority. So here we see that domestic policy, law, and governance institutions become particularly important. So that transaction is notified, merger review is conducted, and the go-ahead for that merger transaction will then be received either with or without conditions. So that's a practical example of why what happens and what exists at national level, what exists at regional level already is extremely important with respect to what we are doing at the AfCFTA level. In the same way, if we take a look at intellectual property rights, again, all of the countries that are members of SADC, the REC, and then the trade arrangement have domestic intellectual property laws. Some are working in particular areas. They may not have, for example, services trademarks. So there may still be gaps in terms of domestic policy and laws that are being developed in the area of intellectual property rights. But again, if, for example, a company, and let's stick to Togo, invests in Malawi and it would like to protect its intellectual property, then it would have to go to the Domestic Property Protection, the IP office, so to speak. And that's so important. So here again, we come back to what exists at the national level. So we've got to recognize that will not change. If there is, for example, an arrangement in terms of the cooperation instrument that we will be negotiating at the AfCFTA level, we may find the equivalent of what we have with ARIPO and with the Intellectual Property Rights Organization, the African Regional Intellectual Property Rights Organization. ARIPO is really important for the countries in East and Southern Africa and a few other Anglophone countries. And it is possible to lodge an application to register, for example, a trademark in all 16 countries that belong to ARIPO through a single application. The office is headquartered in Harare. So it's possible to make a single application to register trademarks in all those member states. In some cases, when we have such regional facilities, arrangements, regional cooperation arrangements, some private sector entrepreneurs may still find it more expeditious, may find it quicker to actually register the trademark in the specific country where they have the largest market interest and then roll out their property protection in the other member states where they will be operating. So this is really where we see how important engagement with the private sector is, because they are the investors, they are the traders. They will be looking at competition governance, intellectual property governance when they engage in cross-border economic activities. And increasingly, through the examples we're mentioning here, honorable members, we see how important cross-border investment is, alongside the trade liberalization and intra-Africa trade that we've been focusing on in our discussion to quite a large extent this afternoon. I want to come back to trade trade in goods and trade in services. It is still true very often when we talk about intra-Africa trade that we are actually talking about trade in goods. And generally our discussions on the tariff concessions to be negotiated and the rules of origin are quite sophisticated because we have been engaging this trade and goods agenda for a very, very long time. If you think when we started negotiating the SADC Protocol on Trade, we concluded that in 1996, so it goes back a long time. When it comes to trade and services, for most of the regional economic communities, this is a relatively newer area of trade negotiations and regional integration. But trade and services, as I've mentioned, if we really look at how important the services sectors are in our economies, we realize also that trade and services is extremely important in terms of generating foreign exchange. So as a foreign exchange earner, think of the tourism sector in the countries across SADC, for example, but think also about cross-border financial services provision, communication services, professional services. So if we really start looking at the detail of the different channels, the modes of supply of cross-border trade and services, this is an area of absolute significance for all our economies. Ironically, even for least developed countries, the services sectors are so important. But trade and services much more difficult to measure. So there are a number of initiatives underway to improve the quality of trade and services data. The World Bank, the IMF, the World Trade Organization, UNTAD, number of organizations are trying to capture bilateral trade and services data more effectively. But this is where, instead of the customs authority collecting the data for trade and goods, the role of the central banks is absolutely critical because they monitor cross-border flows of financial flows. So payments for services, for example, those are so important because those transactions, they're foreign exchange transactions, that is where the central bank has oversight. So the central bank is a very important repository of trade and services data. If we think about cross-border investment, we think that commercial presence in terms of value is the most important mode of supply of trade and services. Those transactions obviously are also captured by our central banks. So that's where we can find a lot of that data. But there's a lot of work to be done to improve the quality of trade and services data and to get accurate bilateral flows. So a lot of work to be done there. Finally, just to come back to the rules of origin. The rules of origin, honorable members, are often the fine print in the agreement that can mean that we have a very trade facilitating, liberalizing free trade area, or we may find that with very restrictive rules of origin for certain products, we will, despite what looks like significant tariff liberalization, still not see significant increase in intra-Africa trade. And I want to mention an example from SADC. We've mentioned it earlier on, but I want to reiterate that. For clothing and textiles, the rule of origin for certain product lines, certain garments, is a yarn forward rule. Both the fabric and the garment must be produced in a SADC member state for that t-shirt, that garment to be of origin of a SADC member state. And that's really important because if we think about the state of the textile industry in SADC member states, we produce some cotton, we produce some other fabrics, but to be honest, production of synthetic new generation fabrics is still quite limited. So if we want to produce products, say, for the sportswear market, then most likely we would have to import the fabric from global sources, and therefore we would not qualify excuse me, for trade under the SADC preferential tariffs for those products. So the fact that the textile industry is relatively small and focused on particular types of yarn and fabric means that certain types of fabric have to be sourced from global sources. And therefore, it's unlikely that the production of those garments would qualify under the current rules of origin, and so not get the benefit of the lower tariffs. So these are the things we have to look at very, very carefully when we devise the rules of origin, because the rules of origin can mean that we will facilitate intra-Africa trade, or for certain products, we actually, despite lowering tariffs, still place challenges, roadblocks in the way in the form of strict rules of origin. So it's something we've got to watch very carefully. Thanks, Professor Rasmus. Any comments from you?
No, I want to thank you, Trudy. I want to thank the person who put those very pertinent questions to us. And I also, when I'm listening to you, Trudy, and I think about these questions, the other point just to make about the AfCFTA is that it is member driven. We will not see supranational institutions in the AfCFTA. The member states stay in control, and because they stay in control, they will also not open up in an unexpected and adventurous manner as far as the existing markets that they have in the regions. So that is why, if we speculate about what we ultimately will see in the outstanding instruments in the final that must still be negotiated, don't expect sudden attacks of generosity and opening up of the whole continent and general rules of origin and so on. It will be a gradual, slowly, conservative, incremental process. And Trudy must tomorrow really share with us some of these offers that have been made as part of the AfCFTA negotiations, and let's see how it compares to what is already in place in terms of intra-African trade, direct trade, and external trade. These were very good questions. Thank you for that.
Thank you very much, Professor Rasmus. Honourable members, thank you very much. I think we've run a little bit over time.
There's another hand
see.
now. Okay.
No, Professor, it was just a clap appreciating the explanations. Thank you so much. I'm just not sure if I'm encouraged or frustrated now with the further explanations, but I guess it says we have to look at this AfCFTA issue very seriously from our countries. Me knowing that Lesotho, for example, we are not a producer of so many things, and now we can only benefit on the lower tariffs when we are producing from our own states. That leaves a heavy burden on my shoulder, but this is what it is. Thank you so much.
Yeah, but you're making also another true observation by implication, and that is Lesotho benefits from AGOA, and your global trade will continue to be very important. So trade is a comprehensive challenge. Trade is a comprehensive challenge, and the AfCFTA does not tell us that this is now the end of our global integration. No.
Okay, that's better.
Okay, some good news at last.
And some good news as far as rules of origin are concerned, because of course the rules of origin under AGOA, which particularly for lesser developed countries as they are defined in AGOA, and Lesotho is one of those, are quite generous. And therefore we saw an industry develop in Lesotho as a result of the market access opportunities, and in particular, the rules of origin under AGOA. So this is a really interesting and important case study, that the rules of origin, really important. So this last mile where we are negotiating the rules of origin for some very sensitive products. We have to monitor that very, very carefully. Honourable members, without further ado, I would like to thank you all for participating so actively this afternoon. And I would like to thank our interpreters for staying the course, keeping us all on the same page. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow morning to focus on SADC. And we will revisit some of the important topics that we've touched on today to give a comprehensive overview of SADC in the context of the discussion of the African Continental Free Trade Area as well. Professor Erasmus, thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing all of you